Welcome to Backbone Unlimited. My name is Matt Hartsky. In this episode, we're talking about one of the most misunderstood and most influential forces behind mule deer behavior in the fall, and that's weather. Every front that rolls across the west changes the game. It dictates where mule deer feed, bed, and travel, and eventually determines when and where the rut will fire up. If you've ever hunted a unit that felt alive with deer one day and empty the next, you've seen it firsthand. It wasn't random, it was a shift in weather, and those who know how to read those changes are always one step ahead. October and November are transition months that define mule deer movement more than any other time of year. In early October, the high country still holds pockets of summer feed and does linger close to their fawning areas. Bucks stay secluded in bachelor groups or individuals, living predictably and feeding in the cool shadows of upper slopes. But once cold fronts start rolling in, especially those first systems that drop temperatures below freezing or leave a thin layer of snow, the landscape, the feed, and the deer all begin to shift. The does move first. They're driven by nutrition and security. Bucks, on the other hand, move when the does do. As the weather continues to cool and daylight shortens, the bucks begin shadowing those groups. Never far behind, but just cautious enough to stay undetected until the timing feels right. Understanding that cause and effect relationship between weather and mule deer movement is what separates luck from consistency. You can glass the same basin day after day and see nothing, only to have a single cold front rolled through and suddenly find new deer that seem to appear out of thin air. They didn't teleport in, right? They moved in with the weather. Mule deer react to those changes faster than most hunters realize. A temperature swing, a hard wind, a barometric pressure drop, it all sends a signal that winter is coming. When you learn to interpret those signals, you stop hunting history and start predicting opportunity. This episode breaks down how those patterns work. We're going to talk about what weather does to mule deer behavior before, during, and after a front, how does and bucks move differently through those phases, and how terrain, feed, and elevation all tie together. Because when you understand the rhythm of the weather, you can predict movement instead of guessing, and that's how you stay in the action when everyone else is wondering where the deer went. When early October begins, mule deer behavior still carries traces of summer. Feed is abundant in the high country, and both bucks and does are scattered across upper basins, alpine ridges, and high sagebrush slopes. The weather is mild, the pressure is light, and deer can live within minimal movement. But that calm balance changes the moment the first strong front arrives. As those systems push across the mountains, they bring more than just cold. They bring change. A drop of 10 to 15 degrees may not seem like much to us, but to mule deer, it's a biological cue that triggers movement. You'll start seeing does working down toward mid-elevation slopes where vegetation stays greener longer, especially those south and southeast facing benches that catch early sunlight. They are not migrating yet. They're just adjusting. They're responding to comfort, feed quality, and wind. For bucks, that shift is subtle but significant. They feel the same pressure change, the same wind patterns, and they react in step with the does. Early October bucks are in feeding mode, right? They're continuing to rebuild throughout the summer and into the fall, but once weather begins to fluctuate, they start patterning off of doe groups more closely. They'll feed in similar elevation bands and bedding areas, not for breeding yet, but because the does are finding the best remaining forage. The connection between weather, feed, and doe movement is the foundation of what will become the rut. This is the prelude to the season's chaos, the quiet before the storm. It's when smart hunters pay attention to the small signs: frost on the grass, shifting winds, the first dusting of snow on the ridges. Those details mark the beginning of predictable movement. When you start noticing how those first cold nights reposition deer, you're already tracking the early signs that lead to the rut, and that's where the pattern begins. By mid-October, the weather turns unpredictable. Some days feel like summer, others bring biting cold and fog that hangs low in the canyons. Those swings are exactly what starts to separate deer that stay put from deer that start shifting. For hunters who understand it, this is the sweet spot, the period when you can still pattern movement before the full migration begins. Every cold front in October acts like a pulse through the mountains. The first one might just drop frost on the sage and harden the ground, but the next might bring sleet or a couple inches of snow above timberline. Each time that happens, does respond by sliding a little lower in elevation. They're searching for feed that hasn't browned out, for south-facing pockets that catch warmth, and for shelter from the wind. These transitions are rarely dramatic. It's more like a slow-motion migration. But if you're glassing the same basin and suddenly notice fewer deer high and more tracks along the mid-slope benches, you're watching weather at work. What makes October tricky is that it's rarely consistent. A week of warm weather can pull deer back up a few hundred feet, especially if the sun opens up those green slopes again. That's why many hunters get frustrated. They assume the deer are gone when they're just adjusting to comfort zones. Mule deer are masters of conserving energy, and they'll always pick the elevation that gives them both easy feed and safety from wind exposure. Understanding that rhythm is how you stay ahead of them. The bucks at this point are still mostly solitary or in loose bachelor pairs. They're not focused on breeding yet, but they're tuned into the same environmental cues as the does. When a front pushes across and drops temperatures sharply, bucks feel it in their metabolism. You'll see them feeding longer in the mornings, bedding on the leeward sides of ridges, and using thicker timber edges than they did in the fall, right? Their movements start to mirror the doe herds because wherever the best feed and least pressure exists, that's where the first pre-rut encounters are going to happen later on. The most productive strategy during mid-October is to think in layers, literally. Glass the transition country between the high basins and the winter range bottoms. Look for those mid-elevation ridges with a mix of broken timber and sage flats. After a cold front, those places become staging zones. Does filter in first, feeding on green shoots exposed by melting snow or protected from frost by sunlight. Within days, small bucks start appearing. Bigger bucks might still hang back, but they're nearby, testing the air and watching from a distance. Timing is everything here. If you're in position right after a front breaks, you'll often catch that first daylight movement as deer stretch, feed, and reposition. The air is crisp, the light soft, and thermals are more predictable. Perfect conditions for observing or a stalk. Many hunters overlook those windows because they think October weather makes deer go nocturnal. In reality, it often makes them more visible. They feed harder before the next storm and move more confidently when the barometric pressure rises again. When you start matching your glassing schedule to those weather cycles, moving when they move, sitting tight when they sit, you'll realize October isn't the slow season, it's the setup season. Every shift you see now lays the groundwork for where the rut will take place in November. Late October is when everything starts to tighten up. The mountains feel different. The mornings bite harder. The wind carries that dry chill that only comes after the first few real fronts have rolled through, and every living thing in the high country starts responding. For mule deer, this is when instincts begin to shift from survival to reproduction. The does are still focused on feed and security, but their patterns are tightening as snow begins to stack higher up. The bucks, still not fully rutting, start to shadow those doe groups more deliberately. This is the pre-rut phase, the calm before the storm. Weather is the trigger that kicks it into motion a lot of times. Each cold front acts like a reset button across the west. You'll see a big front move in, dump snow on the upper slopes, and push deer out of alpine pockets almost overnight. Trails that looked unused for weeks suddenly light up with fresh tracks. The key is understanding where those deer go when that happens. When the first heavy front hits, most does move off the open basins and drop into timbered benches and broken country where they can still find feed. They'll often settle in areas that mix sage, bitterbrush, and low oak or aspen cover, places that provide both food and protection. South and west facing slopes are critical now. They catch more sun and thaw faster, creating small windows of green feed when the rest of the mountain is locked up. These become magnets after storms, and the bucks know it. Big mature bucks that were ghosts all October start to reappear in this window. They've been hanging back, often several drainages away from the doe herds, conserving energy and feeding heavily. But as temperatures drop and the days shorten, they begin making daylight loops. They're not chasing the does yet, they're just checking, right? They'll cruise ridges above the group, scent checking the wind and bedding within striking distance. If you can find concentration of does during this late October stretch, stay close. Bucks are going to begin filtering through regularly as they monitor those groups. The weather is what dictates timing here. When barometric pressure starts to drop ahead of a new system, mule deer activity almost always spikes. You'll catch deer feeding longer, moving earlier in the morning, and standing in more exposed country. They know when that storm hits, feed will be buried again, so they fill up before it arrives. Once the front actually moves in, especially when snow or high winds start hitting, movement drops sharply, right? Almost instantly. Deer bed down in leeward pockets, just below ridge lines or within thick stands of aspen and fir that block the wind. Hunters who stay mobile can catch them on their feet early and late, but the best strategy during those fronts is observation. Watch the protected slopes, glass from angles that look into calm pockets, and mark where you see deer disappear. Because when the system breaks and the sun comes back, those same pockets are going to explode with movement. This is the time when the first rut behavior starts to show. Young bucks are sparring, lip curling, or shadowing does. Mature bucks may still be mostly nocturnal or hidden, but they're near. They'll check those same feeding does at first light and last light, then fade back into the timber. When the next front rolls through and temperatures take another dip, that restraint starts to break. The rut is coming, and the weather will decide when it fully ignites in a lot of places. When November hits, everything changes. The daylight shortens fast, temperatures fall below freezing most mornings, and the first real snowstorms start locking down the high country. This is the turning point, the start of the migration and the beginning of the rut. Mule deer that seem scattered through October start to condense, and weather is the single biggest factor behind that shift. It's not just the cold, it's the combination of barometric drops, snow accumulation, and reduced daylight that flips the switch. The does make the first move. When snow begins to stick on north faces, they drop elevation and start using more consistent travel corridors between feed and cover. These are often the same routes they'll use all winter. Familiar saddles, benches, and low ridges that connect summer and winter ranges. Every front that brings new snow pushes another wave of deer downhill. The bigger the storm, the bigger the movement. For hunters, this means visibility improves dramatically. The open south-facing slopes that were quiet in mid-October now start filling with deer, especially in the days following a storm when the sun softens the snow crust and exposes feed. Bucks are in full transition mode now. They're no longer living as individuals, they're in search mode, constantly cruising between groups of does, testing scent, and covering country. Weather magnifies this movement. A hard cold front, especially one that follows a major snowfall, triggers some of the most aggressive daylight behavior of the year. When the air clears after a storm and the temperature stays low, you're going to find bucks on their feet for hours, moving across open faces and through saddles that connect drainages. One of the biggest mistakes a lot of hunters make in November in particular is assuming deer go completely nocturnal when the weather turns nasty. But the truth is the opposite. Bad weather concentrates them. They might hole up for a short time during the peak of a storm, but as soon as the skies break, the mountains come alive. Bucks that were invisible the day before suddenly stand out against the white backdrop. The key is to anticipate where they're going to reappear. During and right after a front, focus on those south-facing slopes with mixed cover, patches of oak brush, sage, and young aspen. Those spots catch warmth, hold feed, and give deer a sense of security while still allowing them to see danger coming. Elevation is the other major factor here. Every storm steps the herd down a little further. By mid to late November, most high country bucks have followed the does to mid and low elevation ranges. In units with defined migration corridors, you can literally watch the line move downhill day by day as snow depth builds. But migration doesn't mean chaos. It follows terrain structure. Mule deer are habitual travelers using the same saddles, timbered draws, and creek bottoms every year. The best hunters know how to read those natural funnels and get ahead of the flow instead of chasing it. This is the time when the rut hits full stride. The cold, the snow, and the short days all drive does into heat, and that's when the mountains become electric. Bucks that were ghosts all fall are suddenly visible at all hours. They're pushing does, sparring, and constantly repositioning. If you can align your hunt with one of those early November cold fronts, especially the first major storm that sticks, you're going to catch that perfect overlap when the weather and the rut collide. That's when the biggest mule deer of the season make daylight mistakes. Every serious western mule deer hunter eventually learns that timing the weather is just as important as finding the deer. You can have the right basin, the right glassing knob, and still come up empty if you're not matching your effort to the rhythm of the fronts. Weather doesn't just influence movement, it controls opportunity. Understanding what deer do before, during, and after a storm will often let you predict when to move, when to wait, and when to be ready to make your play. Before a front hits, the mountains give subtle warnings. The wind steadies from one direction, the air feels heavy, and the light starts to dull. That's your signal. Mule deer sense those changes long before the first snowflake falls or the first raindrop hits. As pressure drops, they feed longer and move more freely, often exposing themselves in open country where they normally stay hidden. It's an instinctive push to build calories before the storm locks things down. This is when you want to be glassing early and late from vantage points overlooking transition terrain, right? Places that connect bedding cover with open feed. South and west facing slopes are golden here, especially those that catch the last sun before a storm. You'll often see does feeding out in the open with young bucks nearby, and if you're patient, a mature buck will appear on the edges just before dark. When you see this pattern, don't waste time hiking through it. Get set up ahead of a front. Be in position before the wind starts swirling, because once it does, the window closes fast. When the front actually hits, everything slows down. The temperature plummets, thermals collapse, and the mountains go quiet. A lot of hunters head back to camp, but there's still opportunity if you understand where deer ride out the storm. They'll pull into leeward slopes, north and east faces, protecting from the brunt of the wind with thick timber, downed logs, and broken cover. The goal here isn't to cover miles. It's to move with discipline. Still hunt through those calm pockets. Glass small openings and listen. The woods are damp and sound carries differently. A single crunch or a branch snap can reveal a bedded deer. The challenge during this phase is scent and visibility. Wind direction is erratic, right? So you have to use terrain to your advantage. Move along contour lines where the slope blocks the wind and check the air constantly. If you're not confident in your wind, back out and relocate rather than forcing the stalk. The deer aren't moving much, so patience beats aggression. Focus on observing and learning where they're bedded, because that intel becomes invaluable once the weather clears. When the storm finally breaks, the mountains wake up. This post-front period is one of the best hunting windows of the entire season. The sky clears, thermals stabilize, and mule deer start feeding almost immediately. They've been conserving energy for a day or two, and now they need calories. South-facing slopes, benches with exposed grass, and lower ridges that thaw quickly become feeding hubs. Bucks that were locked down during the storm will be on their feet, moving between doe groups and feeding areas. This is when you need to be glassing hard. Get high, cover country, and use that clear, crisp air to your advantage. Deer stand out in fresh snow or wet ground, and movement patterns become more obvious. The first 24 hours after a front are pure gold if you're ready for them. The difference between tagging out and watching tracks disappear often comes down to how well you read that recovery phase. Those who hunt the rhythm and the forecast, the ones who move when deer move, consistently find success, while others are still drying gear by the fire. After a major storm, remember the mountains don't just look different, they function differently. Snow depth, wind exposure, and feed availability all shift overnight, and mule deer respond immediately. If you've hunted the same range for years, you've probably seen it happen. One day a ridge is crawling with deer, and the next it's silent. They didn't vanish, they adjusted to the new conditions faster than a lot of hunters could react. The guys who find them again aren't just lucky. They're reading the same cues the deer are reading. Snow is the biggest driver after a front. It changes everything from travel routes to bedding preference. A light dusting that melts quickly doesn't alter movement much. But once that snow starts stacking past 4 or 5 inches, deer behavior changes dramatically. The does will slide lower and begin to favor benches, saddles, and south-facing hillsides where the sun softens the crust and exposes feed. They're still focused on energy conservation and calories, so they gravitate to any place with a mix of cover and easy forage. The bucks, still wired into the rut cycle, follow right behind them. This is when understanding elevation becomes critical. In western public land country, you might be dealing with 3,000-foot elevation swings from top to bottom. After a major storm, start your glassing at the mid-bands, those transition zones where timber meets open sage or where the aspens give way to brushy draws. These areas act as thermal pockets, offering both warmth and feed when everything above is locked in snow. You'll often find deer bedded tight to cover until late morning, then slipping out to feed once the sunlight starts to warm those slopes. Wind direction also plays a massive role right after the storms. The first day of clear weather is almost always breezy, and mule deer use that wind to their advantage. They'll bed with their noses to the wind and their backs to the sun, usually just below ridge lines or on subtle benches that give them a view of danger, right? From a hunting standpoint, this means you have to be meticulous about your approach. Use topography to block your scent. Move along the same side of the mountain where thermals are consistent and avoid ridges that swirl. Even a good stock can fall apart if you underestimate post-storm winds. Feed is the other major factor here. After storms, deer don't scatter randomly. They key in on very specific vegetation that's still accessible. Bitterbrush, sage, and mountain mahogany are staples during this period. You'll often find deer pawing through snow to reach those stems. In some units, freshly burned areas become magnets because the black soil warms faster and melts snow sooner, exposing green shoots before surrounding ground does. These small details, burn edges, south-facing sage flats, low oak ridges, are what separates the empty glass from the full tag. It's also important to remember that storms compress deer. Heavy snow funnels them into the same pockets, concentrating both does and bucks. That can make the hunting incredible for a few days, but also means your presence stands out. You've got to move more carefully, glass from a distance, and avoid blowing out those pockets prematurely. When the next front rolls through, they're going to shift again, often just one drainage or ridge away. If you can anticipate that movement by tracking elevation and weather side by side, you'll stay on the deer all season instead of chasing where they used to be. After every major storm, the mountain resets. The wind writes a new story. The snow reveals fresh tracks, and the deer redraw their boundaries. The hunters who adapt fastest, who understand how elevation, feed, and wind shape mule deer survival, are the ones who keep finding them long after everybody else has given up. When you start viewing October and November mule deer hunting through the lens of weather, everything starts to make more sense. Those random days when deer disappear or show up out of nowhere aren't luck or mystery, they're timing. Weather is the great mover in the West. It dictates where feed grows, where it dies, and how every deer on the mountain reacts to those changes. Once you understand that rhythm, you stop hunting guesses and start hunting cause and effect. Every front that moves through the mountains resets the landscape. The first few in October quietly shift deer from summer to fall patterns. By late October, cold air and shortening days pull does into concentrated feed zones and bring the first bucks to their edges. In November, snow and cold fronts light the match that kicks the rut into motion. The deer are no longer scattered. They're funneled, focused, and moving predictably between feed, cover, and breeding zones. The best hunters in the West aren't chasing deer, they're positioning themselves where weather will push them next. That's why paying attention to the forecast is only half the job. Anyone can read temperatures and snow levels. The real skill here lies in interpreting what that means for the terrain. A north wind and fresh snow means something entirely different in the foothills than it does in the alpine. A 10-degree temperature drop might push deer 500 feet down in one unit, but trigger full migration in another. What matters most is understanding how weather interacts with the specific country you hunt. The truth is, you don't need to out-hike everybody. You need to outthink them in the way that when the average hunter says the deer just aren't here, that's your cue to look one more ridge over, because that's usually where they went when the last front came through. Every cold snap, every shift in the wind, every line of clouds stacking over the divide tells a story. If you can learn to read those signs, you're never going to feel lost in October and November again. You're going to know exactly where to look and why. Weather also reveals character here, both in the deer and in the hunter. When the snow flies and the wind stings your face, most people head back to camp. The ones who stay sharp, stay patient, and move with purpose are the ones who fill tags. Because when everyone else sees bad weather, they see a window. They know the storm isn't an obstacle, it's an opportunity. And that mindset is what separates those who find success from those who just tell stories about it later. If you're serious about taking this kind of knowledge deeper, that's exactly why I built Team Backbone. It's more than just a membership. It's a way to sharpen your edge with exclusive tools, strategies, and a tribe of hunters who refuse to quit. Inside, you're going to get 20% off site-wide on all Backbone Unlimited gear, a member-only t-shirt shipped to your door every month, not available anywhere else, full access to the digital content vault of guides, checklists, fitness programming, backcountry strategies, and mindset training, a private Facebook group with direct access to me and a community of driven hunters who live relentless, direct call, text, and email access to me for personalized advice on training, hunting strategy, or just sharpening your edge, and automatic entry into monthly gear giveaways. This is built for the guys who train for the hunt, push themselves in the off season, and want to be part of a tribe that makes them better. If you're ready for that kind of inner circle, then Team Backbone is waiting for you at backboneunlimited.com underneath our membership tab. Thanks for being here. Until next time, train harder, hunt smarter, and never settle.